All right. Hello, everyone, and greetings from the hilltop. Welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Investing in ESG, part of the 2021 Graduate Alumni Reunion virtual programming series. I'm Lauren Apsella, Associate Director of Alumni Relations for Georgetown McDonough, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to share a few tips and reminders. This broadcast is being recorded and will be shared with you in the next few days. Our panelists will take questions at the end of the webinar. Please send in your questions as you have them throughout using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please submit those concerns to me via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We're going to hear from a great panel today, moderated by Vishal Agrawal, Provost Distinguished and Lapeyre Family Associate Professor, as well as Director of our new Business of Sustainability Initiative. We have one more event as part of our reunion programming series tomorrow, and I hope to see you there as well. And we've just dropped the link in the chat. And now I'll pass it on to Vishal. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's my absolute pleasure to have three great panelists who also happen to be alums who have had incredible experience in this space, and I'm really excited to learn more from them about this. The only other thing I'll mention is that we are launching a new Business of Sustainability initiative today. You will have a link to the website for it in the chat for you to look at. And I'm happy to reach out to me if you have any questions or you would like to engage with us through the initiative. Now, let's get started. What I would really love to do is briefly introduce my panelists, but then also have them talk a little bit about their experience, their approach in this space, what exactly they do, and how they sort of got there. So first, let me start with Jeff Cohen, who's the Director of Capital Markets Integration and Head of Private Investments Initiatives at the Value Reporting Foundation, which is the newly merged organization of the SASB Foundation and the International Integrated Reporting Council. Jeff works with institutional investors, asset owners, integrating financial materiality and industry-specific ESG factors, and also happens to be an MBA alum from Georgetown. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about your experience and your approach here.
Thanks, Vishal, and thank you, Lauren, and everyone for having me. It's nice to, at least virtually, be back and connecting with everyone. As Vishal put it, work very closely within the investment community, really aiming to work with folks, whether they're just getting started or have been doing this for a number of years, on how they can take the SASB standards. SASB is short for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, for those that are less familiar, and embed them as part of an investment process. And this is across asset classes. I've been in this space going back to late 2014, early 2015, but ultimately focusing on the intersection of where ESG issues are financially material and on an industry-specific basis, so it can be embedded in pre-investment due diligence, ongoing monitoring, the development of risk factor models, as well as to inform multifunctional reporting. So that's communicating both very traditional performance attribution, as well as connections between financially material issues, as well as outcomes that can be achieved that are potentially positive benefits to society and the environment at large. Have been doing this for a number of years, focusing primarily within the private markets, but also work across asset classes, and have had the pleasure of working with both Natasha's former organization as well as with Miguel and his colleagues at Federated Hermes. So it's a pleasure to be here, Vishal. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And it was completely planned that there were connections between all the panelists. Next up, we have Miguel. Miguel is currently an Associate Director for EOS at Federated Hermes and manages their engagements in the North American region. Prior to that, he worked with Wells Fargo within their Environmental and Social Risk Management group, where he's refined the tools, procedures, and methodologies to lead the bank's lending activity in this area. He also is an MBA alum from Georgetown MSP, and I've had great pleasure of sort of working with him on a couple of student projects in the past year. Miguel, would you like to share a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, Vishal. Also definitely want to echo Jeff's comments here. It's always a good sign when you're jealous of current and prospective students. So very happy to be kind of convened with this panel here today for this sort of discussion. As Vishal mentioned, Associate Director of North America for EOS at Federated Hermes. What our group does is provide investment stewardship and engagement services, including making proxy vote recommendations on behalf of approximately 70 long-term institutional investors and pension funds. In terms of our current assets under advisement, that has reached an approximate 1.75 trillion. And to Vishal's earlier point too, I've worked in the sustainability space from a multitude of perspectives. Prior to my MBA at Georgetown, I was in-house operational sustainability staff for the largest land developer in the Philippines. I've also worked following my MBA at kind of the NGO think tank sustainability consultancy side, working with Ceres Inc. as their financial sector program manager. And primarily through my experience at Wells Fargo, have also been involved in the risk analysis, due diligence, methodology development, and made the jump from Wells Fargo to the asset management kind of stewardship landscape with Federated Hermes. I've only ever had sustainability roles, and if I could encapsulate my overall professional goal, which was consistent going into the MBA and is still present on the back end, I hope to bring the business case for ESG and sustainability to an unassailable position, and feel that Georgetown helped empower me to do so. But thanks, Vishal. Back over to you.
Great, thanks, Miguel. And I should add, that's kind of the business case for sustainability is the motivating animation behind the initiative that we're launching today. So it's great to sort of hear that. Our third panelist for today is Natasha, who's a retired partner of Capital Group, where she was an equity investor specializing in emerging markets for 18 years. And her last role was the first global ESG investment director. Natasha is also a Georgetown alum, I believe School of Foreign Service, and more interestingly, has a sophomore at Georgetown MSP, which we're very excited about. Natasha?
Thank you so much, Vishal. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My background is almost entirely on the equity investment side, where I discovered the importance of ESG metrics and financial materiality pretty much through the painful experiences of things going wrong in a number of companies across emerging and developed markets. And most of the time, it was not because they missed their quarterly earnings or did something sort of financially difficult or wrong. It's mainly because they had missteps in governance, or they had missteps on the regulatory side, and they didn't look after their human capital, and things that which we now encapsulate through a bunch of funky acronyms, including ESG, which we had considered long ago as just very material, non-financial drivers of successful investment results. And so when Capital asked me to think about sustainability and how we can formalize it in a framework, and how can we better integrate financially material ESG metrics, and we work very closely with SASB on that, one of the things I wanted to make sure we do is integrate it throughout the firm, and that we don't make ESG a product. I don't think it is a standalone asset class. I think it is an essential ingredient in successful long-term investing. And that is very much what I think active investors do anyway, but we hopefully will do it better now with the help of much more rigorous and standardized disclosures and metrics, and more focus on engagement, frankly. So now that I have stepped away from the investment world and I am a board member in a number of companies, I get to see from the inside, how that works. And two of the companies where I serve as a board member are brand new to the market. We've just IPO'd literally in the last 12 months, these two companies. One company is a very established emerging market financial services firm, which is really rigorous in thinking through sustainability issues in its loan portfolio, in its loan book, and its impact across the market, where we're the largest financial institution on the retail side. So it's fascinating, actually, for me, and gratifying to see how much this weaves into everything that a good business is doing and ought to do going forward. And I'm also based in London, so I must say that there's a lot more day-to-day discourse and traction that we see on issues pertaining to environmental externalities, on responsibility to society, and things which, there used to be a really huge transatlantic divide, whereby Europeans sort of cared about the soft stuff and Americans didn't. And I think that's less and less true.
Great. Thank you so much, Natasha. Something you just said led me to this one of the questions I was going to ask. So the audience today, we have alumni who are interested in this space, but we also have prospective students. And one of the things, even as somebody who sort of understands a little bit the space, not to the level of all of you experts, one thing I think would be really useful for people to hear from you. What are some of the misconceptions or aspects about ESG and this space that you would like people to know about or clarify about, right? This is one of the space where there's a lot of terms, a lot of acronyms, a lot of difference of opinion or confusion about what the approach is, whether it's the business thing, all of that. So I thought maybe a good question, just from your perspective, what are a couple of things that you would wish to explain to people or communicate so that it could really help people understand this space better?
Great, that's a wonderful way to kick off. I'll go back to what I mentioned in my introductory comments, is that while there are many new funds out there that call themselves sort of ESG funds or sustainability funds, I think it is incorrect to think of ESG as a product. It is a process. It is a set of tools and metrics that help businesses run a more resilient, long-term, sustainable operation. And it is also a lens which helps investors identify risks. And this is all pretty long-term stuff, even though ESG metrics specifically can and should be measured annually, such as emissions, such as water intensity, such as other sorts of things that are very, very important in specific sectors. The long term is far more important than the short term rush to measure and disclose everything. So those two things are really important to keep in mind, is that it is a process, it is a long-term way of improving how businesses run and managing risks and optimizing the positive benefit that business has to society. And it is something that needs to be measured and disclosed each year, but that's not the end game.
Great, thanks, Natasha. Miguel?
Natasha, I feel like you had exactly my notes in response to this question. So I think you focused on exactly the right things. And maybe to underscore the point further, I think there is still maybe a lingering misconception that these are non-economic conversations. By mandate, in my role, I am only allowed to talk to companies about long-term value and the priorities of their shareholders. And I think, harking back to Jeff's opening comments, ESG is not tangential to economics. It deals with capital allocation, with asset valuation, merger and acquisition criteria, long-term shareholder value, and is certainly ingrained at the core of the investment theses for every single client that I represent in each company conversation. This certainly also deals with license to operate, and to Natasha's point, a variety of very core, tier 1 level risk categories. I also wish to dispel the misconception that this is not voluntarism and philanthropy. This is very different here. I'll pass it over to Jeff.
I don't really have a whole lot to add. I mean, I think Natasha and Miguel said it very well. Look, there's also no right or wrong way to do this. I think that's an important thing. It depends on the asset class in which you're operating. It depends on the time horizon in which your sort of investment strategy is set up for. It depends on your macro views. So there is no prescriptive way in which to apply this, but I really do want to underscore this is a process. You could name something ESG or sustainable or whatever. But as many of you may be aware or maybe not, there have been pretty watershed lawsuits for firms that are claiming to be more than they are actually committing to and adhering to within their actual processes. And there is likely regulation coming to combat this epidemic known as greenwashing. So I would simply say that there is no right or wrong way to do this. You can view this through a values-based lens, you can view it purely through an investment-based lens, or both, and beware of the name and always understand where it is integrated in the process. And that's, I guess, the only thing I would add or echo from what Natasha and Miguel shared.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think thinking about the process is fairly important. And Natasha, thank you for sort of highlighting the difference between measuring things and the metrics versus actually using them and sort of having a long-term view on that. In that regards, I do find that a lot of the conversation stops, like sort of Natasha said, at just measuring and the metrics, but that is fairly important. So maybe let me talk a little bit or ask you about what is the cutting edge or the current best practices in terms of the data and the analytics which is being used for this sort of analysis. What are some of the best practices, and where do you sort of see that, not just measuring it annually, but also then incorporating that in decision making and the process for the business?
Well, maybe I can just kick this off because we've gone through now a 6-month process with one of my companies to set forth our ESG strategy. And while the starting point is always going to be SASB, I think for most companies, that's sort of the go-to place, you then have to supplement that with some internal soul searching and engaging with associates and management in the firm to highlight other issues which may be much more local. For example, this company is Moroccan. So in a frontier market, in a developing country, there are other issues which can be material, even if they're not taken into account sort of in a generic subsector framework. And it's really important to reflect those. Did I just lose you?
Oh,
No.
nope, I think we
Okay,
still have you,
so-
Natasha.
Oh, okay. So because I can't see you anymore. That's bizarre. Ah, now I'm back. I'm sorry. So that's one thing that's really important. And we felt that with the help of an external consultant, putting it together, was a very comprehensive process. But then you end up having way too many metrics. And then the management just goes, whoa, wait a minute, this is an alphabet soup, and it's a whole lot of work and data that we're just not set up to collect. I think it's really important also to note that this is a very resource intensive process. I as a board member spend half of my time on the board, doing this. And then we take, basically one other resource from the CFO's team to do nothing but sort of ESG data collection. And that's already a lot. For a small company, it can be very challenging. For larger companies, obviously, they have more resources to be sort of, at their discretion to be using, but this can be really challenging. So then it's really important to really filter what are going to be the most important KPIs that management can be held to account on. And most importantly also is what is the appropriate time frame to get these things done. Again, in emerging markets, frontier markets, there's a time frame that has to be realistic. And in Europe, you have a lot of regulatory pressure as well to produce certain metrics and produce improvement in certain metrics, which makes it essential that management is sort of incentivized, rewarded, measured on these things, because they then become, really quite mission critical. So I think there's not a scarcity of data or metrics. In fact, I think we're drowning in them, but I think the challenge is to filter relentlessly and select, what I think amounts to no more than a dozen metrics that can be then built into some sort of a monitoring, measurement, and compensation mechanism on a 3 to 5 year basis.
Can I just add to that real quick, Vishal, if you don't mind?
Of course.
Natasha brings up a good point. There are a lot of different organizations that are looking to advance communication of ESG related information from issuer to many different types of stakeholders. So it's really important for companies and investors to know what is being communicated and who it's intended to be communicated for. So my organization focuses on enterprise value creation. So it's designed for an issuer to an investor dialogue and conversation. There are many different other initiatives. Some are putting out frameworks, some are developing standards, and the two of these things are very different, where they're aiming to communicate to a broader set of stakeholders, such as customers, their own employees, local communities, because companies serve, companies are seeking to share information, not just with investors, but with others. And then there are some organizations focused on very specific thematic areas like just climate or just human rights, or insert the specific issue area. And they all have developed different work products where companies can potentially communicate consistent with those. I love the consultants out there and they're doing great work, but it is sort of in their interest to make things, to obfuscate things so that they can justify their services. But they're not always operating in that, with that sort of nefarious intent, of course. But it's important for companies to understand who are they trying to communicate to and what is the best channel in which they should use to communicate that information. And the idea that's important here is, especially for small cap companies and SMEs and private and sort of non-public world, how can you take the same piece of information and communicate it across multiple channels? And that's something that is increasingly an area that we're focused on and really important for sustainability professionals to have a good handle on.
Yeah, and actually just connecting both your and Natasha's point, Natasha talked about this filtering of which ESG metrics are salient, important for you. That kind of goes back to her earlier point that you need to understand what market, what business, what process you have, and then connects to Jeff's point that a lot of companies I work with, it may not be the investors, it may be the customers who are the most important stakeholder, or it's the employees, and that could completely change how you filter those metrics or performance indicators that you need to be focusing on or that you need to be communicating on. So sort of aligning all of that is quite sort of essential from both regards. Miguel, want to add that?
No, I think very well said. And Vishal, to that last point, I think, we're also seeing a boom in the marketplace for kind of ESG related jobs. And I think the point that you just underscored, that depending on the constituency and priority, intended message, recipient of those messages, it underscores the need for an ESG function, even if this consideration should be integrated across traditional business functions. And I think also alluded to within Natasha's and Jeff's comments, ESG expertise is very different if you are trying to advance kind of in-house your own company's ESG journey, or if you're an investor or a financer and you need to have kind of a lay of the land and understand what robust ESG strategy, sustainability strategy means across any number of industries and types of companies. And I think the question at the outset was, who are some of the data providers and what are the data sources here? I think a lot of folks on the call and certainly our panelists might be very familiar with the well-entrenched, widely adopted providers, the MSCIs, Sustainalytics, ISS, True Costs of the world. But we're also certainly seeing a bunch of more niche players popping up, particularly with regards to climate risk. I'll say that, amidst all of this noise, amidst the proliferation of data sources, data providers, acronym soup, you are seeing companies increasingly getting the calls from a wider variety of stakeholder constituencies. And as a result, you're seeing a lot of net zero 2050 ambitions or broader long-term visions for the company. And the gap that's created there is the how and what takes place in the interim. And so forgive me again for putting on my perspective or current student's hat, but I think that also creates increased demand for answering that question. How will this take place? What are the interim steps? And certainly I'm a fan of Vishal, the program and the initiative to kind of link business with ESG and environmental expertise to fill that need.
Great. Well, that gives me a perfect opportunity to plug this new degree that we're launching. Somebody will drop a link in the chat. But the kind of gap and the need for expertise that Miguel and other panelists have sort of highlighted is exactly what we're trying to prepare students for. We've just launched a new Master's in Environment and Sustainability Management, where we're going to blend both scientific knowledge as well as business knowledge to sort of bring that, right? So not just that you understand what some of the scientific background is and how to sort of be the liaison between the people who are measuring things, but then figuring out how to actually understand the business processes, the business stakeholders to be able to integrate and fill that gap. So if you're interested in that, somebody will drop a link to our new degree in the chat, but that's exactly something that we're trying to work on, both with the initiative as well as at things at MSP. So maybe another question that I'll ask all three of you is what are some of the current trends, the current directions that you see happening in the space, or maybe some future trends that you see popping up or that would be interesting for all of us to know about? Anybody could get us started? Let me go to baby Miguel first. Yeah.
Sure, very quickly and kind of thinking about the asset management slice of the pie. I think every year you're accustomed to seeing in the proxy season a say on pay. What do shareholders think about the way compensation is structured for senior executives at a company? But you're increasingly seeing say on climate votes, whether these proposals are advanced by management or by shareholders, similar to compensation. You're seeing much stronger shareholder engagement to kind of validate or approve a company's approach to addressing material E, S, and G issues, and in this instance, climate. I think it would be, for those who might not be aware, a very helpful exercise to review this latest 2021 proxy season, particularly for the oil and gas upstream and super majors. As you'll note, even the engine number 1 process for ExxonMobil, basically, there are a whole suite of new directors that have been onboarded to Exxon's board due to concerns about their approach. You'll see similar kind of say on climate and GHG target setting proposals that passed with, at times over 80% support for Phillips 66, ConocoPhillips, and a number of these majors here. You're also seeing, to Jeff's point earlier, some of the kind of courts coming in and dictating what is a suitable decarbonization strategy. All to underscore the point that this is, certainly moving from the periphery to the core.
Jeff or Natasha?
I guess I can say that a couple of things I've noticed is that it's becoming much more important internally at companies to have a coherent and well-communicated sustainability plan, which is not just aimed to external stakeholders, but that also unites and aligns the people who work in the company. And I think before it was considered something of a compliance exercise that companies, especially in extractive industries or, sort of resource intensive industries, have to do to stay out of trouble. I think that has really shifted to something that companies need to do to build a stronger culture, to have a stronger sense of sort of purpose as a business, and not for sort of external consumption and risk management in that sense. The other thing I would say is that, again, geographically speaking, I think that we're converging much faster than I expected around the imperative on climate action and certainly climate reporting, but also on the importance of human capital. And while there's still some very significant geographic differences in what is considered good governance, there's a lot more consensus now on what is considered good human capital management and appropriate environmental measures. So it'll be interesting to see how that third aspect evolves, because governance is very different. For example, in the US, it is very common to see the CEO and chairman be the same person. In Europe, separation of church and state in that sense is considered much more important. And in Asia, there are all kinds of other governance issues with, conglomerate type structures, which have family founders and ties. And so I think it's ironic that actually, whereas everyone thought that, governance is the easy part, I would very much beg to differ. And I think that we still have to sort of figure that out. And it's vitally important for the long-term successful outcomes on environmental and social sustainability issues.
Great. Jeff, anything to add?
Benchmarking is what is coming next. I can't say exactly when, but at the rate at which companies are increasingly disclosing ESG information and coalescing around certain channels of communication for specific stakeholders, and this is relevant in both public and increasingly now even in private markets, there will be a meaningful enough sample size to facilitate benchmarking and comparison. That will allow for rigorous quantitative analysis and comparison as far as who is getting better or worse, and not according to a third-party rater and ranker who have divergent methodologies, but according to market-informed standards, so that can also in and of itself facilitate engagement. So that is only going to add to the rigor of the field and the utility of the content from a quantitative standpoint in the investment process. So that, I think, is something that I'm constantly asked, like, well, can we regress this? Can we go back and test this? And the answer is largely, it's like, well, the information's not there yet, or it's inconsistent or incomparable. That is going to be changing very soon. Not in a year, probably more like, I'm going to give myself a lot of wiggle room here. 2 to 6 years is when you'll have a meaningful enough sample size to begin inferring useful insights from a benchmarking standpoint. So that, I think, is something really to keep your eyes peeled for.
Great. And actually, let me ask a question from the audience, which is quite related to what we're discussing. We talked a lot about some of the environmental metrics. Natasha mentioned the importance for the governance part. One of the questions that we have from the audience, and this is something I hear a lot and I think about a lot as well, is that perhaps we have more experience with environmental stuff and we have more concrete knowledge there, but what seems slightly less developed is the S part, the social part. So any insight into how you see the social dimension that companies could get better at or have more experience developing that aspect?
Well, if I may, I'll kick this off. I think this is much more of a question that's industry specific and region specific. For example, in the US, companies routinely ask their employees to disclose their race and ethnicity. In Europe, it's simply not done. And in many countries, it's actually illegal, and if you were to go to Asia and ask about minority stats, you get, sort of apples and oranges in terms of responses. So I think that the social sustainability issues are very diverse. They need to be really fine-tuned for the sector, subsector, type of company, the region where the company operates, and the regulatory framework, as the backdrop. Environmental metrics in that sense are easier because they are, just by their very nature, much more generic and quantifiable. Although, again, I think industry-specific measures are very important.
Fully agree with Natasha's point. I think there's certainly sector, business model, geographic lenses that need to be overlaid on S-side issues. I think this underscores the importance of all the work that Jeff is doing because routing what is a relevant S issue, depending on a company or sector, that's incredibly important information. I think also, to Natasha's point, E-side metrics kind of lend better to quantitative analysis, or at least historically have. And there's a cacophony of issues that are under the S in ESG. So we can think about DEI, we can think about workforce representation, we can think about pay equity, and in the entire landscape of human rights, we can think in-house and supply chain versus community-related impacts. And again, to Natasha's point, what bubbles up to the top as most relevant really depends on a number of different contextual clarifications. So I wouldn't say that the S is underdeveloped, but I would certainly say it's more nuanced and maybe not as relatively simple as E-side issues.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments there. One, my colleagues in the research department, for which I will pass along the credit that Miguel kindly bestowed onto me, have been undertaking a holistic review of human capital related issues across the standards. Because ultimately, the evidence is harder to find as far as their connectivity to financially material issues, but that's becoming it's becoming a little bit more robust. And secondarily, Miguel alluded to some boutique data providers. There are some that are focused entirely on the S component. There's a group in Canada called S Factor that they pull in inputs from like 40 or 50 different data sources in order to quantify some of the social related issues. SASB standards are one of them. They're not paying me to mention their name either. But that's just an example of how this, S sort of as an umbrella structure for these various issues is becoming more mature very quickly. But yes, historically, there is not as much quantifiable data as there are on the environmental side.
Yeah, and I'll add something that Jeff said, which is, I think, a challenge in this context, and that is something definitely that on the research side, some of us faculty members are thinking a lot more about, is the connection of some S-related initiatives or efforts and the connection to financial returns, right? So some of the work, for example, I've been looking at is looking at social related issues in supply chains where companies are investing in, and what are the financial returns on that, or what is the business case for doing that, so that it's not just philanthropy, but actually makes a business difference. So for one example I could give you is companies who have connections to agricultural supply chains all over the world, And if you're investing in initiatives such as women's economic empowerment or technology provision, how does that make business case, right? And there's some fascinating examples out there. But yes, we need to learn more and we need to do more in that aspect of being able to make that connection from S-related issues to financial return. I'll take another question from the audience. We have an alum from the MBA program, Clark Dumas, who's asking about their company is a tech platform that reduces waste and increases safety and reliability, and would like us to comment on any metrics around or any information around the increase in investment companies are making in this space, or if there's a VC money going specifically to ESG-focused companies.
Sorry, do you mean if there's more investment flows to better ESG profiles? Well, I think it's important to take into account that we only have a few years of data. And during this few years of data, the evidence does show that companies that have higher or better ESG scores and ratings have attracted more investment and have also generated higher multiples. But I really believe that we need to think about this from a long cycle perspective. And sometimes in the short term, there's a lot of correlation noise. And there's also some thematic sort of flow into companies that are innovative in renewable energy space or innovative around, circular economy space. So that's all great. But I don't think of ESG as a product. I think of it as a very long-term process, and that good companies will be able to shine through the economic cycles and through market cycles by effectively deploying appropriate ESG policies, measuring and disclosing them. So I just want to leave everyone with that thought, that even if in the short term, optically you can say that, yeah, there's lots of money going into these ESG funds or ESG companies, we need to be patient and wait, for the long-term results of how this works through an economic cycle, market cycle, and see truly who the winners are.
Great. One other question, just looking at the time, I want to make sure we hear from all three of you about this. So some of the attendees, as I said, are prospective or current students, as well as alumni who may be interested in working in this space. What suggestions or advice would you have based on your experience for our prospective and current students or even alumni for pursuing a career in this space? Jeff? Yeah.
Sure. Who doesn't love a million letters at the end of their name, right? So in addition to pursuing some great educational opportunities through Georgetown, there are a number of growing and increasingly reputable, I guess you can call them credentials or certificates that you can get in this space, particularly relevant for those of you who are maybe trying to break into this space and want to demonstrate a commitment to it. The CFA has launched a certificate in ESG investing that was formerly just UK based, now it's global. So that's something worth exploring for those of you looking on the investment side. Our organization has something called the Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting. That is worth exploring both as an investment professional, consultant, or looking more as a corporate sustainability professional. And there are others that are sort of more boutique or bespoke. I would say that those can be incrementally positive to demonstrated educational and sort of experience commitments. But I said this the last time we chatted, Vishal. Depending on the industry that you want to pursue, just being a specialist within the environment or social related issues in and of itself needs to be paired with something else. And the quicker you can sort of connect the two, and if it's in the investment space with a CFA or with coursework in financial modeling, or if you want to be a sales or sort of client facing person, being able to understand how to talk about this is really key in order to find an opportunity in this field.
Great. Miguel?
Definitely want to second Jeff's comments, and I'll just note that across our stewardship team at EOS, I think there's over a dozen leaders and senior level, director and associate director, that actually have obtained the CFA and fundamentals programs and certifications that Jeff mentioned. I'll take a little bit of a higher level approach. I'll say that there are a number of ways. There's 50 shades of sustainability types of and ESG types of roles. You could perform a traditional business function for a responsible operator or company. You could also take the consultant route and advise companies around relevant, material ESG issues and how to make suitable progress. Or, to Jeff's point towards the end of his comments too, you could really develop your own expertise and be an in-house subject matter expert at a core ESG function. Also, I'll just note that the Georgetown alumni community really does have a spirit of co-opetition, and those in the sustainability space tend to help each other. So happy to take questions, outside of this panel for any interested students. But my final advice might be to, again, to Jeff's point, think about the desired real world impact you hope to actualize, be that in an E, S, or G category. To think about your own specific skill sets and any gaps in skill sets and how you might want to address them, and the desired position of leverage, to my earlier point. And when you can align all three, you're finding yourself in a strategic ESG function that is well suited for yourself.
Right, Natasha?
Well, I have the CFA ESG certificate, and I did that in 2019 when I was still at Capital to show my team that everyone can do this, and that everyone should do this. And we hope that most people will see that as being one of the, very straightforward, comprehensive ways to educate yourself, first of all, but also to demonstrate your commitment to doing it right, to doing this whole integration process right. I've also taken courses from my other alma mater, from Harvard Business School, on the executive education side. There's an excellent course on creating shared value, which is essentially a sustainability course taught by Michael Porter. Rebecca Henderson teaches an online course on sustainable business strategy. And there's a million great books out there, that you can read as well. Most importantly, I think is for each individual to know where do they fit on that value chain. Are you an operations person? Are you a finance person? Are you a client-facing person? And then you can figure out, sort of where you can contribute the most and where you need to fill in the learning gaps that are required.
Great, thank you all. I'll take this moment to thank all the panelists for their excellent wisdom and input and experience and sharing that with us. With that, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Vishal. Thank you all. I appreciate all of you coming here this afternoon to listen to our wonderful panelists speak. I am going to put a slide up on the screen. There you go. We ask that you please take this survey and let us know what you thought about the panel. This will help inform future alumni events, both on sustainability as well as other related ESG topics. But I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. Thank you, Vishal, for moderating, and thank you all of us for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.